and welcome to this special show on ET Now. Today we are extremely privileged to have with us Acharya, former Deputy Governor, Reserve Bank of India, presently Professor of Economics in the Department of Finance at New York University Stern School of Business. Viral first made history as the youngest to be appointed Deputy Governor, Reserve Bank of India in January 2017, and then again made history when he resigned 6 months before the end of his term. So thank you very much, Viral, for taking time out to speak with ET Now in your first interview after you returned to New York. And congratulations also on your book, The Quest for Restoring Financial Stability in India. Well, financial stability is the holy grail that all of us are looking for, and you've made a number of thought-provoking statements in your book. But given the extraordinary circumstances facing India and the world today, let me start by asking you about Government of India's rather niggardly support package in response to COVID. It seems to fit in with your warnings about the dangers of India's large fiscal deficit, especially how it constrains monetary policy. In fact, the central theme of your book is about the dangers of fiscal dominance. But in today's scenario, where growth is expected to contract in the current year, many would argue, and this includes die-hard conservatives like the IMF, that this is not the time to worry about fiscal deficit. It is not going to result in crowding out of private investment, and there's very little risk of inflation as well. Government spending is the only thing that's keeping the economy afloat. So are worries about fiscal deficit overdone at this juncture, Viral?
Thank you, Mythili. First of all, it's very nice to be talking to the Indian audiences again. Before I comment on the present scenario, of course, first and foremost, I want to thank all the medical staff and all the policy officials, not just in India, but all over the world, who are really doing God's work, so to speak, in helping deal with the crisis. Now, coming specifically to the Indian setting, there are three issues I would like to explain and touch upon. And you are right, this gets to the core of the book. First is the initial condition. At the time of the COVID. You know, a big point about financial stability is that you don't know where the stresses are going to come from. They arise as relatively unexpected scenarios, just the way the COVID outbreak has hit us. And so it requires preparation, leaving aside some buffers for scenarios such as this. Now, unfortunately, I think the fiscal stretch over the last decade has been one that's been greater than I think what leaves the economy buffers to accommodate a scenario such as this. And I think, in my view, this is the first and foremost issue that needs to be tackled. Coming to your second point of are the fears overdone, I would say no. Let's just think about the situation we are in right now. On the one hand, the health curve is not actually coming down. So the virus is actually spreading to new hotspots in India as we speak, even though there are some signs of stability, maybe early signs of stability in a few areas. So, the thing about the virus is that it shows that for an economy to work well, different parts of the economy all need to be firing at the same time. You can't just have an isolated pocket in the economy that's in an unaffected area and expect that that's going to lift the entire economy out. So there will be some protracted slowdowns associated with the lockdowns. And therefore, everyone, as you said, even the conservatives are actually calling for some action, some accommodation of these issues. Now, what needs to be done, in my opinion, is that while undertaking the necessary expenditures, in order to make transfers to those who are the most affected, simultaneously the government needs to build credibility about sustainability of debt going down the line. Okay. I think we can talk more about this, but to me the fears are not overdone. I don't think the IMF is saying that we need to go on a fiscal stretch, leaving all caution to the wind.
No, absolutely, but whether should we worry more about the size of the deficit or how it's financed? Because the fact is that revenues are going to fall dramatically this year. So is it possible that monetization of the deficit could be an alternative? Because central banks all over the world are doing it. And even normally conservative economists, monetarists like Dr. Rangarajan, have said in today's juncture, maybe monetization should not be a very bad alternative. And it can be done in exceptional circumstances, because you were against it, the amendment to the FRBM Act, where it says that you can do it in exceptional circumstances. Aren't these sufficiently exceptional? Can we make an exception just for once, as long as it's temporary and limited?
That's a good question, Mythili. So first, let's just take stock. I think the system in India is already in massive liquidity surplus. Most would argue that actually the central bank has been monetizing the deficits of the government even prior to the outbreak of the COVID. So I'm always a bit surprised about this discussion is, oh, shall we monetize now? I think we have been monetizing even before because the size of the fiscal deficit is very large. And if you try to place this much paper in the bond markets, the yields go up and the central bank then responds to that. This has been one of the points I'm trying to make quite clearly in the book. Second, even if you monetize, at the end of the day, in the consolidated balance sheet of the government of India, which includes the RBI balance sheet, this is no different than actually the government issuing paper. What's happening is that by keeping the reverse repo rate very low, and coercively forcing the banks to actually hold the excess liquidity that's in the system, the central bank is effectively reducing government's cost of providing this. Now, of course, to the extent that it is mopping up the liquidity at the end of the day at the reverse repo rate, some of these gains are done away with because they will result in a smaller surplus that's going to get handed over to the government at the end of the day. And third, I think taking this view that this is really the consolidated balance sheet debt that we are talking about, I think at the end of the day, what the country needs along with a fiscal stretch, I think the issue to me is not of monetization. I think I have no problem if RBI goes ahead with the monetization. I think the key issue is, will the markets perceive the debt to remain sustainable? Or will they anticipate that when the debts are to be rolled over, even though we are running fairly high inflation right now, we have 6% inflation over the last 2 quarters, will RBI be able to maintain its inflation focus while at the same time ensuring that the government debts don't go out of a whack?
Many would argue that monetary policy has reached its limits. There's nothing much it can do further. So is it the time to shift to some other macro-prudential tools, maybe regulatory forbearance? I know you've been against it in the past, but as I keep saying, these are exceptional circumstances, and even Basel Committee has said maybe there is a case for regulatory forbearance.
I'm not in favor of this at all. I would be fine with a 3-month or a 6-month debt moratorium and a delay in the recognition of assets. See, Mythili, we have seen how this ends. We have just seen it in the last decade. It's very tempting in desire for short-run growth to actually hide the problem under the rugs. It's very tempting to move the fiscal deficits out of your balance sheet and hide them in off-balance sheet vehicles, etc. But that doesn't mean the problem goes away. Come tomorrow, there are newer problems to fix. There are newer shocks to handle. So my recommendation in line with what I'm trying to say in the book is that first and foremost, the system must guard financial stability, because that is what will ensure that as and when the growth recovers, as and when the virus is under control, as and when we are on a path of recovery, we get healthy credit creation in the economy. So that requires, in my opinion, 2 things. One, giving confidence to investors that India's debt is on a sustainable path. This means retaining inflation credibility and simultaneously bringing in a new slew of fiscal reforms. This may mean, how will we adhere to FRBM targets? Do we need an independent fiscal council? Can we improve the accounting of our fiscal expenditures? Do we need disinvestments to happen in a substantial way? And second, more importantly, I think this is a great time, given the buoyancy of the equity markets, of the equity flows, to actually recapitalize the banking sector, both for public sector banks as well as for the private banks. So I would say create loss absorption buffers and capacity in the system rather than say we are simply kicking the can down the road.
Okay, Viral, since you were a member of the first MPC, how do you see the inflation targeting experience in India? As a runaway success or as a qualified success? Given that much of the fall in prices was because of the fall in oil prices and good harvests. And in hindsight, do you think we ended up sacrificing growth at the altar of inflation targeting? Because the slowdown began well before COVID. So should we rework the inflation targeting regime? Or was the problem more the way the MPC interpreted the target as inflexible rather than flexible?
It's a good question, Mythili, and I want to give a little bit of a backdrop of why inflation targeting is recommended and why it has been adopted in many countries. It is primarily to commit to the external investors that when the country's desire for growth, desire for fiscal expenditures, etc., becomes large, the central bank will not sacrifice inflation in its desire to help roll over these debts or help create growth. And I think any assessment of inflation targeting framework cannot be separated from how the external sector has behaved over the period when inflation targeting has been adopted. My sense is that India has done extraordinarily well on this front since the taper tantrum. We had a pretty serious oil price rise in a very short period of time in 2018. It was not easy, but nevertheless, we managed to navigate through it without any serious repercussions on the external front. And there's an excellent paper by Poonam Gupta, Barry Eichengreen, and co-authors as an objective assessment of how inflation targeting has behaved. They actually acknowledge that the MPC has been quite sensitive to output gaps in its decisions. It is not that the MPC has primarily focused just on inflation and disregarded the qualifier, which is while paying attention to growth. I think the concern with separating ourselves from the primacy of the inflation objective is that my concern is that you might end up in a situation where you are neither achieving growth nor inflation. And I think that's a kind of a scenario we have to worry about right now.
You're right on that, Viral. But in your comments, I was looking at your comments in the minutes of the NPC, and in June 2019, which was your last NPC meeting, in fact, you quoted Ernest Hemingway in Old Man in the Sea to say, "It is better to be lucky, but I would rather be exact, because then when luck comes, you're ready." That's an excellent thought, except that when it comes to central banking, by its very nature, it's terribly inexact. It's often described as an art rather than a science. So how wise is it to look for exactitude? Does it risk mixing the larger picture, as seems to have happened in 2018?
Yeah, I think that's one interpretation of Ernest Hemingway. I think another interpretation is that you be as exact as you can given the information that you have at any given point of time. And I think I'm glad you mentioned about those minutes. I had been warning actually in February, April, and June meetings that I don't think the 12-year inflation is as benign. A 12-month inflation is as benign as we think it is. And let's just talk facts. I think over the last 2 quarters, the CPI inflation is above 6%. So I think those who are saying this is not the time to worry about inflation, my question to them is, why? Why is it not a time to worry about inflation at all? Because we are still at the upper band of the mandate that's been given to the central bank. So how can we just set it aside? I think the supply push pressures are gradually building up in the economy. Will they generalize or not? That requires some calculations to be done. Last point, I think central bank does require judgment. It does require good intuition. Nevertheless, there is ample scope for models. There is ample scope for econometric analysis. And I think what that does is that it disciplines you as a decision maker because the pressures are always there. Of course, every central banker would like low inflation and high growth. That would be like a dream Goldilocks scenario that you would want to create in your economy. But if you go too far in one direction or the other, you could end up making huge errors. And models actually curtail the size of the errors that you're likely to make on either side.
Well, you're right. It is a very tough balancing act. In fact, the title of our book, Restoring Financial Stability, suggests that financial stability is worse today than it was in the past. But the reality is that the 1990s were far worse. Gross NPAs touched almost 16% in 1996-97, even though the definition of NPA at that time was much less stringent. However, subsequently strong growth in the 2000s saw a sharp fall in the NPA ratios. So does higher growth lead to financial stability, or is it the other way around?
I think it's clearly both ways, Mythili. But I think going back to your 1990s analogy, I think it's a perfect one because what has changed dramatically is that we are now a much more market-oriented economy than we were in 70s and 80s. We were a highly repressed, essentially a nationalized economy at that point of time. That's no longer the case anymore. Our private sector is very large. Our private sector needs to borrow in the markets. We don't just have public sector banks. We also have private sector banks. And what we have seen over the last decade is that even if the banks are public sector banks which are making the losses, even if they have the implicit guarantee of the government so that you don't get runs, Nevertheless, you don't get the credit allocation that you want out of an undercapitalized banking system. In my view, we can't take the stance of the 70s and 80s anymore, that as long as banks are not failing, we are fine. No, we need high growth. We need high growth given our demographics, given our population growth. We need high growth given the stage of development and poverty where the country is right now. And we have to secure this over a long period of time. I think to be a great nation, we have to plan for 10, 20, 30 years ahead. We can't be fighting each war just with a focus horizon of just 1 year or 2 years. I think that is what needs to change fundamentally, in my opinion, in bringing financial stability back to India's macroeconomic shores.
You spoke about public sector banks, and that's been a very key issue with both you and the former governor Urjit Patel. And you say an integral part of ensuring financial stability is changing the ownership of the banks. But the fact is that private sector banks are not fared very much better, really. And public sector banks, let's accept it, do play a very important role, rightly or wrongly, whether you agree with the logic or not, in achieving government's social objectives, where it is Jan Dhan accounts, lending to MSMEs now, or even in the post-2008 crisis, keeping the economy afloat through aggressive lending. Though now, of course, we're paying the price because we didn't roll back those measures sufficiently quickly. So does the answer really lie in privatization of public sector banks, or should the focus be on improving governance, ensuring arm's length distance, the BBC model if you want? I'm asking you this question because just recently, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, in a recent interview, and he's not a fan of public sector banks, said quite emphatically that he's not an advocate of privatizing public sector banks. And this was reiterated by Sanjay Nayak of private equity fund KKR, formerly with Citi. So do we need to take a slightly more nuanced view of public sector banks? Does the answer lie in privatization?
It's a very complex subject, but I'll try and see if I can give sort of the gist of what I want to say. First and foremost, I would beg to differ on the view that private sector banks have fared as poorly. Actually, if you construct an index of if you had invested $1 in private sector banks in India or 1 rupee in private sector banks in India in, say, 10 years back, and you put the same investment in public sector banks, I think there is just no comparison in what they have delivered on return on assets, return on equity, shareholder performance, etc. This is not to say that private banks will not get into trouble. They will get into trouble. In fact, as I try to explain in the preface of my book, one reason why I think the private sector banks also are not being run as well is because the overall regulation of banks in the economy is brought down in order to accommodate the public sector banks because the government is not willing to recapitalize them in time. The government is always fiscally stretched. It turns to the RBI looking for routine forbearances of various types. But RBI doesn't set regulations separately for public sector banks and for private sector banks. And so you get a race to the bottom as far as the banking sector regulation is concerned. And I would like to give the example of the Bandhan Bank, actually. Let's ask who has actually achieved more financial inclusion, delivery to the last mile, over the last 10 years, last 15 years. It has been our microfinance institutions and banks such as Bandhan Bank, which of course evolved from a microfinance institutions into a bank. So I want to fundamentally question the thesis that what public sector banks are performing right now is actually a development goal. You will see one of the board members, Mr. Marathe, has also suggested that we keep public sector banks public because of India's development objectives. Yeah, sure. If we have to do that, yes, we still need to dilute the stakes because the government doesn't have the fiscal capacity to recapitalize these banks. We may want to try 1 or 2 sample privatizations because I think that may bring in the talent, both on the managerial front and the employee front that these banks need. But other banks, we can make them extremely focused. Why are all these banks universal banks? If their goal is development, why aren't they a focused development bank like a microfinance institution? Okay. So I'm with everyone here that we need to try a few different options that help public sector banks be better than where we are right now.
Okay. Let me now turn to fiscal dominance and external fragility. You said fiscal dominance leads to external sector fragility, as financing by foreigners to corporates and governments far exceeds what would be needed if government was not preempting domestic savings. So why has India escaped the wrath of markets? Far from being punished like some Latin American economies, our forex reserves are at an all-time high, FDI is at a record high, FII flows have been good though volatile, the rupee has been fairly stable. In fact, the RBI has been struggling to prevent appreciation, unlike on the taper tantrum days. All this despite the high fiscal deficit, slow growth, rating downgrade. So can we say it's not really a one-to-one relationship?
What happens on the external sector, Mythili, is that these episodes happen as sudden stops. So you need a confluence of certain factors to not work well. What has worked the most favorably for India has been the glut of dollar supply over most of the last decade, I would say. But both during the taper tantrum as well as during the oil price rise of 2018, what we saw is that this stability is very fragile. So things look very stable, nice and beautiful as long as the oil prices don't rise. And the moment they rise, the fundamental weaknesses of our foreign flows, the fragility of these flows, the fact that our fiscal deficits are not actually, they're sort of knife edge. They are not sort of leaving headroom in order for the investors to have great stability. But I want to make one point here that I think is quite important right now. As you know, we are talking about creating a series of bond tranches which are going to now enter international emerging market bond indices. Now, having taken that step, I think it's absolutely crucial that the debt framework, which includes inflation targeting, but it also includes, in my opinion, adherence to fiscal targets over the medium run. And I think we really ought to put in place an independent fiscal council so that we give credibility to external investors on the accounting of our deficits, that even if we extend the deficits right now because of COVID-related issues, that as growth recovers, we will actually consolidate these deficits back. So I think we should not ignore the external sector stability. I think we do it at our own risk. Believe me, 2018 was managed well, but it wasn't easy. It was actually a war on the external sector. It may have been just 6 months, and I think we managed it well. Nevertheless, it was a stressful period for the Indian economy.
When we move to something that's very close to your heart, Viral, that is central bank independence. But the fact is that differences between central banks and elected governments are quite routine, given their different time frames and the pulse of electoral politics. You've given the analogy of the T20 and the Test match, with government intent on approaching issues as though it's playing a T20 match, and RBI viewing it as a Test match. However, if differences prove irreconcilable, how should central banks push? Should they go public, or should they hold back to avoid rocking the boat?
I think my sense is, a central banker is a public servant at the end of the day, and who they have to serve is the public. So to the extent that the pressure on them is not in the interest of the public, I think it's perfectly fine for central bankers to have a voice. In fact, I think I would like the system, like our entire system, to have more independent voice than it does right now. See, you can do a lot of backdoor agreements and everything can look fine. But to what purpose of the people of the country? I think that is the fundamental question we have to ask. I think this is why we wrote the AD Shroff Memorial lecture. And I think it was absolutely the right thing to do, to give a window to open a public debate on the issues. On the one hand, we want to say that the reason why we are not able to deal with the NPA problem is because 10 years back we made the mistake. And yet, when the short-term growth pressures grew for the present-day governments, they want us to do exactly the same thing. And this is actually the antithesis that we were sort of fighting against. In my view, we actually saved the system. I think the pressure on the systems to do exactly the excesses that we are still trying to clean up were tremendous.
Okay.
I think we put up a very...
Okay, so given what you said, Viral, I have to ask you this last question before I let you go. How would you look back on your stint at the Reserve Bank? Was it very different from what you expected when you left New York? Also, given that many DGs went on to become governors, Dr. Rangarajan, Y. V. Reddy, Urjit Patel, would you be open to the idea of returning as governor later, even if it is, in the words of Dr. Manmohan Singh, former PM and also former Governor, Reserve Bank of India, the loneliest job in the country?
Yeah, I think my stint was terrific, actually. I did expect tremendous government resistance to the problems. I don't think at the end of the day, I would say what I saw was that unsurprising. Maybe it was a bit more. It was a bit more, if I could use the word brazen, than what I might have thought it to be. Nevertheless, I think I was prepared for the situation. I think that's why, as I say in the chapter, I wanted to hit the road running if there was a meeting of the minds with the RBI, and we did. And I think, as I was going to say in my last sentence to your earlier question, I think we did put up exactly the resistance that a central bank fighting for financial stability would. I think it came at a huge professional cost to some of us. But I think we thought, as public servants, given the legal mandate of the RBI, this is exactly what we needed to do at that point of time. Yeah, would I be willing to come back as the governor? You know, my sense is this is a dream job for any researcher and policymaker such as me. I would absolutely be open to the idea. I think it is not the loneliest job in my view. I think it is probably one of the most fascinating jobs. It puts you in touch with almost the entire spectrum of the different sectors of the economy. And I think one can make a truly meaningful long-term difference, as these wonderful governors that you listed have in their respective tenure.
I think we should tell Dr. Shaktikanta Das that every time he has a sleepless night, that you described it as a dream job. But I doubt many of our viewers will know of your musical talents or that you've composed a music album. But I'm sure I speak for many others when I say it would be great to have a singing governor. Imagine what monetary policy press briefings would be like. And they could sure do with some livening up. So thank you very much, viewers, for speaking with us in ET Now, and all the very best.